Some of us have classes at 1:30. That's why I would like to start, and I have a privilege and honor to introduce a good friend of mine, a fantastic lady with the brilliant history in diplomacy, Ambassador Karen Pierce. What is interesting that I don't know if it is a coincidental or not, but we have meetings every 10 years. In 1997, I was appointed as Deputy Ambassador to London, and at the time, Ambassador Pierce was the chair of the Russia, Belarus, and Ukrainian desk. And then in 10 years, I arrived to United Nations to serve as ambassador there, and Ambassador Pierce was at the time Deputy Ambassador of the United Kingdom, and now again. So this is really a privilege and honor to introduce Ambassador. She has just arrived, just fresh, only a few months in March. But what a tremendous work she did. Well, I took some pictures only, well, just to from your Twitter. Well, look, Archbishop of Canterbury. So Ambassador Pierce is promoting the interfaith dialogue. Well, declaration on the peacekeeping initiative, which was adopted this year. United Kingdom was one of in the first rows promoting the changes and approaches to the peacekeeping. Well, the Syrian conflict, United Kingdom and the mission is the leader in finding the way out of this crisis. Well, chemical weapons, and recently, well, the differences inside the Security Council between several permanent members, including Russia. So that's why I have a privilege to introduce our dear guest today. And once again, one picture, Colombia. Colombia, where United Kingdom standing behind the peace-building process there, and successful process. And this is the final act when Ambassador Pierce has a meeting with the leaders of Colombia and the Ambassador of Colombia to the United Nations. And again, it's my privilege to introduce, him well, Professor David Cameron, Director of European Studies Program at Yale University, and he will moderate today's meeting. With that, Ambassador, I invite you to take the floor. And thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Yuri, and thank you, Professor Cameron, and thank you to the Jackson Institute for inviting me today. It's a great honor to be here. I'm afraid it's my first visit to Yale. I know Harvard quite well, so I apologize in advance for that. But I'm hoping to get to know Yale a little bit today. And I've just spent some time at the British Art Gallery downtown, which of course was given by Paul Mellon, and there were some really wonderful pieces there. So if anyone hasn't been to that gallery, I think it's well worth a visit. Professor Cameron was telling me that he's a lifer from Yale, which is obviously very distinguished. I went to a different Cambridge myself. I went to Cambridge in the south of England. But it is delightful to be here, and I've just met some world fellows from Britain who are studying here at Yale, and clearly it was very careless of me not to have managed, as an Americophile, to have included on my CV a stint here doing the World Fellows Programme. We usually send someone from the British government each year, and we haven't got anyone this year, but that's something I should be trying to rectify, and I shall use it as an incentive to encourage high standards of performance in the UK mission in New York. So thank you again for inviting me. I've been asked to talk about Europe after Brexit, but also about the UN and multilateralism, which is very timely given the UN General Assembly that we've just had. And I thought if I talked for about 20-25 minutes and then left the balance of time for you to ask questions, that might work quite well. But if you want to interrupt me, please feel free to do so. I don't mind that at all. Most days I do a press briefing and they're not polite. So I suggest that you operate on the same principle. As I said, this UN General Assembly was a very timely moment for what we call the rules-based international order, but one might also think about it as the system of multilateralism. And I think it's fair to say that there is a great deal of unpredictability in the world at the moment, and there is a great deal of uncertainty about how, in the 21st century, 100 years after the end of the First World War, which set or began to set many of the frameworks and the country boundaries that we cope with today, what is happening to the global order. And it is under challenge from a lot of different places, and I'll come on to those in a minute. I think I would say that reports of the death of multilateralism or the world rules-based international order are much exaggerated. But I think there is no doubt that international power dynamics are complicating the execution of that rules-based international order, and certainly are making the foundations for the UN, which ought to sit at the top of the system, and it has kept us all safe, that system, since 1945, kept us safe and prosperous. I think it's fair to say that the UN now sits on a shakier foundation than it used to. And then you have challenges such as the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea, and some people would add Europe and the United Kingdom leaving the EU into the list of challenges, but I'll come on to that later, if I may. I think since its foundation in 1945, the UN has always suffered from a gap between the noble purpose and the high levels of ambition of its founders and the reality. So the UN has always struggled in a way to put that core purpose into practice. That's not to say it hasn't done some truly amazing things. It gave us the concept of peacekeeping. It feeds something like 480 million people. It vaccinates 90 million people. At its best, the UN is the protector and saviour even of millions of ordinary citizens around the world. But it isn't always fit for purpose. And in many ways, this challenge that's coming to set the rules of the competition, it's a competition to set the rules of international affairs, primarily between the West and the likes of Russia and China, but there are other elements in that that make this a particularly complicated question. I don't know how many people here grew up with an innate love of, appreciation for the United Nations and everything it was meant to represent. I grew up in the 60s with a whole series of TV programs like Man from U.N.C.L.E. And Thunderbirds, and my all-time favourite, The Champions, which, to indicate a break with the Cold War, was set in Geneva, a neutral country, and amazingly enough represented the armed wing of the United Nations, which is a very strange concept. But my point is that in the 60s, it would have been unthinkable to think that more UN, more supranational institutions were not the way to go. And this was reflected in popular culture. And we've come on quite a journey since that point. I think there are, as we saw at the UN General Assembly this September, people are starting to realise that the rules-based system is under challenge, and they are starting to rally to its defence. And what you saw when all the leaders spoke in the General Assembly was a huge amount of sentiment defending the UN, defending international law, and defending multilateralism for its own sake. Now, that's a very different thing from putting that into practice and individual leaders taking individual choices which will reinforce those three things. But it was striking that very few leaders joined President Trump in his distinction between patriotism and globalism. Most leaders wanted there to be both together, and that would certainly be the view of the British government. They're not antithetical, those two concepts. They exist side by side. Certainly my mission is there not only to promote global goods and values, but also to defend, promote and advance British interests. And we see no contradiction there. And it was interesting that countries like the Chinese, the Indians, some of the smaller countries, while calling for the UN to reform, did rally to the notion that the multilateral system needs shoring up, needs defending at the moment. And I think one consequence of that will be how do we prepare for the UN's 75th anniversary in 2020. There may be some very fundamental things coming, ought to be coming, about how we reform the UN and how we make it modernise so that it isn't seen as a 70-year-old institution that's still trying to deal with the end of the Cold War, that it really does become a very modern enterprise. And that, of course, will involve modernising its structures, modernising the Charter, and looking at Security Council reform, which is quite a difficult issue for all sorts of political as well as technical reasons, and we can come back to that. One of the most interesting speeches at the UN General Assembly that's just passed was that of the Russian foreign minister. Now, he has a riff that he likes to play out, that it's the end of the West. Modern times are the end of the West. They're the end of Western European values. They're the end of the system that was set up after the First World War, after the Second World War. But I think in the context particularly of this year being the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is a narrative we need to push back on. And I'll come on to that in a minute. I think there are some inherent characteristics of the multilateral system today that are leading it to be particularly vulnerable, in addition to the international power dynamics I mentioned at the beginning. And I think there are broadly 5 of these areas. I think the first is obviously the international power dynamic. It's a more aggressive Russia, and we saw that with Crimea, we saw that with what it's doing in the Donbass. But not only there, we have seen it on the streets of Salisbury in the United Kingdom. We have seen it in the tolerance, if not encouragement, for Syria to use chemical weapons in eastern Ghouta and Douma. Chemical weapons are prohibited under international law. They are a form of weapons of mass destruction. We would argue that the Russians, as a permanent member of the Security Council, should be joining us in trying to uphold and reinforce these prohibitions, as opposed to vetoing moves in the Security Council to try and do just that. So you have a very uncertain and aggressive Russia. You have a more assertive China. China pursues her aims in a different way at the UN from Russia. It is both possible to work with China, even as we may contest and oppose some of the things she does on human rights, some of the things she does in the South China Seas. Nevertheless, in certain areas, particularly health, it is possible to work at the UN and in the multilateral context with China, but we need to be very careful that the Belt and Road Initiative does not become a vehicle for Chinese asset stripping of the countries it invests in. From our perspective, that Belt and Road Initiative is welcome if it genuinely enables the economic development, prosperity, and political representation of the countries where China is investing. And I think there is a question mark over that last point. And then, of course, you have the position of the United States. I personally, having been the trade ambassador in Geneva, think President Trump has a good point about the way China is cheating and not playing by the rules of the international trading system. But I think, above all, those of us on the other side of the Atlantic, we want to see a strong America. Since 1945, world affairs has never known an America that isn't engaged in detail with a whole range of international affairs. And certainly at the UN, countries define themselves by what America thinks, either to support America or to oppose it. But if there's no American voice, then a lot of things go by default. And at the moment, neither Europe nor China are ready or mature enough, for want of a better word, to step into America's shoes. And America has been overall such a force for good in the world at its best, what Roosevelt called the righteous application of force, that we do believe America first also equals America engaged, however much we support America in defending her individual interests. So I think that is a very important theme of international affairs. Those of you who enjoy reading Dr. Kissinger's books will be aware of his argument that the New World Order will involve the US and China somehow finding a modus vivendi. And I think that has to be right. But at the same time, I think it would be a very detrimental step if that modus vivendi took us back into the old Cold War style spheres of influence. And I think that's something to avoid. I think the second theme I'd particularly highlight that challenges the system at the moment is the role of the emerging powers. When the UN was founded, there were 55 member states. 11 of them, so 1/5, sat in the Security Council. Now you have 193 member states, and you have 15 members of the Security Council, 5 permanent members. And even if we enlarge the Security Council, we are clearly not going to take it up to being 1/5 of the membership. So there is a representation deficit that you see echoed in some of the other big international institutions. And somehow that representational deficit is going to have to be remedied, either at the 75th or 80th anniversary or in some other way. If we do not manage to remedy it, then I think we will find that large, powerful countries, growing countries like India, will simply take their international business elsewhere, and it will become much more intergovernmental rather than supranational. They will use other fora outside the multilateral system, what you might think of as plurilateral. Already organizations like the WEF, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, are trying to take on some of the roles that more naturally would go to the United Nations and its agencies. And then I think another feature of that is that you have a lot more activity in international affairs. One only has to look at the Middle East and compare it to 10 years ago to see how many more countries are active on the world stage, for good or for ill. There is an existentialist rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran that is driving some of the conflict. The British government is on record at setting out its opposition to a lot of what Iran is doing in the region. And of course, the Iranian position is not new. But I can remember immediately after 9/11 when it was possible to work with Iran. So there is something about finding a way to work with these new, I won't say new powers, because some of the countries have a very long and distinguished record, but I will say newly assertive powers, newly economically developed powers, and that is making a big difference, and this is one of the Russian foreign minister's contentions. And I think a feature of that also is that countries are simply less impressed with the West than they used to be for a whole range of reasons, but it also plays in to how they view human rights. I think 5 years ago, it would have been axiomatic to most countries on the Human Rights Council that there was a direction of travel on social issues, on human rights issues, on LGBT issues, for example, and that they may go along that trajectory more slowly than others, but there was never a doubt that it was the right direction to follow. And I am not so sure that one could say that today, even in the 70th anniversary year of the Universal Declaration. And so somehow we have to get back to that Universal Declaration, which was ahead of its time when drafted in 1948, and puts a huge emphasis on equality before the law, which countries ought to be able to rally to. And then my third theme would be, if there are new countries, there are also new issues. Disruptive technology, cyber, artificial intelligence, an open internet. These are all areas where the international community and the multilateral system has, I won't say flailed around a bit, but there aren't the same mechanisms for these interesting hybrid areas that there are for some of the more classic types of hard security. And we are going to have to get to grips with that because if we don't, then countries that are authoritarian will start to use the international system in order to put in place frameworks and controls that will work again a multi-sectoral model going across government, across civil society, across the private sector, academia and the media, in favour of one almost wholly beholden to government. And on top of that, I would say counterterrorism. There aren't any really good international mechanisms, even through the UN, on counterterrorism. Peacekeeping is all about militaries on the ground, trying to keep a peace that is seen as static. Counterterrorism requires much more law enforcement. It requires getting the balance with human rights right. It requires a lot of police work. And at the international level, that is exactly where the security gap is. And then lastly, I'd add into the mix the fact that, as I said earlier, the system we have is based on 1945. It's very state to state. But a lot of what happens in the world these days, for good, for bad, comes from non-state actors. It comes from multinational corporations. It comes from terrorists. It comes from insurgents. And yet the legal frameworks are very much based on state-to-state obligations. So there is something in that about a mismatch between what's actually happening in the world and the international cooperation frameworks on a legal basis that we have to deal with that. So for all those reasons, I think the multilateral system is under challenge, but I don't think it is inevitable at all that it starts to disintegrate. I think, on the contrary, the scale of the problems facing countries is coming to be perceived, as Kissinger said, as unprecedented interdependence. And I think people also look at what's happening in places like Ukraine, and they see the chaos that sort of Russian interventionism can lead to. And I think that is driving people to want to cooperate more. But they want to cooperate on a more modern basis than we have had hitherto. So I think the challenge for diplomats like me is to find what is that modern basis that renews the purpose of the United Nations, but has space in it for all these new powers to come in and work more closely together. Where does the UK fit into this? Where does Brexit fit into this? You know, at one level you might think it sounds a little bit strange to be talking about a stern, robust defence of the multilateral system, and then for the United Kingdom to be leaving an organisation, an institution even. I would argue it's not that strange. I don't think the threat to multilateralism comes from countries or individuals for that matter, exercising their inherent and legal right to withdraw from institutions and treaties. We may disagree with President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but that is a very different thing from the illegal annexation of Crimea. Those two things are not comparable, and we need to be very clear what we're dealing with when we talk about them. The United Kingdom is following its democratic vote to leave the European Union, but we have stressed, and all our politicians stress, that we are not leaving Europe. We will still share Europe's values. We still base our society around the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We will still be in NATO. We will come to the defence of NATO members in the way that we are obliged to, and we will unconditionally support Europe's security and safety. And ministers have made that very clear. The exact terms of the UK's withdrawal from Brexit and the new relationship we will have with the European Union, as you will know, is under discussion. We expect it to be resolved in the coming weeks. We want it on our side to be based around a genuine partnership, but a partnership that really enables free trade and enables Britain to maximise the prospects of free trade, not just for ourselves, but for all our partners. Free trade is a very difficult concept, I think, for publics to grasp. Ever since Lloyd George managed to refer to a bread tax in order to bring home to people quite what protectionism was really doing to their food supply, it has been counterintuitive, I think, for domestic opinion to really rally to the notion of free trade. But it is the concept that has, on the whole, kept the world moving forward economically. So you will find us still being a champion of free trade and of things that go with that, of competitiveness and productivity improvements. And I think it's very important to set that out economically, because there aren't too many champions of open trading at the moment. And I think it's very important that we don't lose the gains that has brought over the years. We are still working out with the European Union our exact trading relationship with them. You will have heard in the press that the Prime Minister has put forward a checkers model, which is based around a certain degree of alignment. There are also other models out there, but for the moment, the United Kingdom is working on the basis of the Prime Minister's proposals, and we are hopeful that we will be able to reach agreement with our European Union partners, but we will always continue to work very closely with them in multilateral fora, whether that's in the UN, whether it's ad hoc in places like the OSCE, whether it's coming together in the Human Rights Council. We have too much in common to be easily divided, though we are sure that there will be some malign forces out there that will try and exploit any differences. But we also feel very strongly it is unprecedented, though not impossible, obviously, for a country to leave the European Union. In our view, that means there can be unprecedented new arrangements for the relationship that we have with the European Union having left. We will not just be any old third country. We will be a very special one, who for 40 years shared in many of the successes of the European Union and indeed led some of them. So we hope to be able to put all that together, finalise the withdrawal treaty and work out our new relationship with some of our closest friends. I think if you turn around and look towards the United States from Europe, I think a Britain that has more independence of action will actually be an even better friend to the United States of America. We will be able to join the United States in certain ventures, e.g. on sanctions. but we will also have at our core, I think, the role that Churchill originally envisaged for the United Kingdom. He saw a strong United States of Europe and a strong United States of America, with a very strong United Kingdom in the middle, so a three-legged stool. And I think we need to do our utmost to make that work, because, as I was saying earlier, the forces of malign activity in the world are really contesting the model that we have sought to build since 1945. And I think the most useful thing we can do for future generations is to make that three-pronged approach as open and responsive to world affairs as possible, while being open to collaboration with all those countries who believe in representative government, who believe in freedom of assembly, who believe in freedom of expression. So all those really core principles on which the world has functioned so well, and the United Nations has functioned so well since 1945. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pierce, and you've given us a great deal to talk about, the geopolitical context and the issues that exist in the world, the challenges in the UN, in a UN of 193 countries, quite different from the UN of 1945, and the relationship, the evolving relationship of the UK with Europe, and of course with the US and with China and Russia. So a real tour de force, and you've given us a lot to talk about, and I think I'd like to open it up to some questions. And I see Paul Kennedy sitting here, who may be interested in talking about any one of those issues. Paul?
Ambassador Paul Kennedy from the History Department. Thank you for coming to Yale. We get too few visits from the British delegation, or indeed the British Embassy in Washington, to this most Anglophile of the US universities, as you've seen by going to the British Art Center and everything else around here. But thank you for breaking that and coming to talk with us. Ambassador, I was going to ask a question about UK and Brexit, but my heart sinks and groans every morning at the idiocy of a Brexit step, so I won't. Can I come on to something more specific that you mentioned, which might have a possibility of international improvement? You mentioned that going up to 2025 or 2020, you would be looking again at the issue of reforming the UN Security Council. A group of us at Yale academics with an international commission tried 23 years ago to produce a report for Boutros Ghali called the United Nations in its second half century, which listed as one of the key issues for improvement, reform, change, the alteration in both the processes of the Security Council and the need for an enhanced membership of the Security Council. Like many other wonderful international reform proposals, it died in the dust because of the reality of power politics and the veto system at the Security Council. What chance do you think there is for serious constitutional change of the Security Council in the next few years, please?
Shall I answer one by one? Well, thank you very much to Professor Kennedy. It's a huge honour to be here and also to see you, sir. And if it's helpful for the UK mission to the UN to come here more often, I have some very lively and brilliant people in my team who would really relish the chance to come and talk some of this through with you all. So if that's useful, Professor Cameron, Yuri, we could perhaps be in touch about that. I think it's a perfectly valid challenge, and to a certain extent, some of us are status quo powers in a way. I'm an optimist, and I think you have to, if you want anything to change at the UN, first of all, believe it can be done. Because if you start from the premise that it's all too difficult, then what happens over time is that people like India, and they have already said this, move away from the multilateral system. They move outside the UN, and ultimately, I don't think that's helpful. So I think there's a reason to keep trying. I think that without being Panglossian, I think the context is different from when you tried before. It's even different from when Kofi Annan tried to reform the UN in 2005. And it's different precisely because of this perceived challenge to the way the rules of international affairs are set. You know, and now we have always seen invasions of other countries. We have always seen people withdraw from treaties, as I was saying earlier. But there is something about the scale of what's happening. There's something about the economic might of China and her almost expeditionary approach. There's something about the risks of a potential US disengagement that I think are making people think more about this. But I also believe that those countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, who argue for more intergovernmentalism as opposed to supranationalism, but intergovernmentalism within the UN framework, I have to say I think they have a point. Now, it is incredibly difficult to reform the Security Council for all the reasons you were saying. It involves changing the Charter, and to change the Charter ought really, under the rules, to require unanimity. There may be ways of getting around that. But principally, of course, it requires the Security Council to be a turkey that votes for Christmas. And the veto is there precisely so the major powers don't have to face that choice. And one can lament that, but I think it worth recognising that the veto is what has kept the UN and the Security Council in being for nearly 70 years and ensured it didn't go the way of the League of Nations. So some of expanding the Security Council will need to include persuading Russia and China that this is in their ultimate interests. And for that to happen, it cannot be a Western do-gooder enterprise. The emerging countries I referred to earlier need to start telling the likes of Russia and China that, for example, economic investment will be linked to their approach to reform of a body like the Security Council.
Yes, over here. Oh, yes, please.
Ambassador, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Brexit creates a major military deficit in the European Union, absent NATO, obviously. And I heard you say that the UK will always defend Europe. My question is, do you see your statement as leading to a treaty, or do you see the existing frameworks sufficient to effectuate your statement?
Well, thank you. This is one of the issues that is being discussed between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And it's one, of course, in which member states have a critical interest, as opposed to the Commission perhaps negotiating en bloc for the rest of the Union. Whether or not there would need to be a separate treaty, I don't myself think there would need to be. We have Article 5 in NATO. We have a number of clauses, principles within the European Union treaties that Britain is already on record as saying we will abide by. I suspect there will need to be specific agreements for specific operations. We await to see exactly how data sharing and intelligence sharing will come out. There are implications, obviously, for cooperation on counterterrorism and cooperation on things like sanctions in all of that. And we are awaiting the outcome of negotiations to know exactly how the implementation period, the period that runs from 30th of March 2019, will actually operate in practical ways. So I think there may need to be specific arrangements, but in order to get the principles right, I wouldn't think that we must start from the negotiating position of a separate treaty.
Yes.
Thank you, Ambassador. You have mentioned that, this is going to set a precedent, obviously, the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. My first part of my question is, are you expecting or are you striving to set an example as to future exits can be based on the UK's exit plan? And the second one is, the European Union said many times, especially in response to the Chequers plan in Salzburg, that there will be no cherry picking. So how do you expect them to come back and give you a counter proposal based on the Chequers plan? Thank you.
Thank you. We are on record, the British government is on record as saying it wants the EU to succeed. It is not our intention to lead anybody else out of the European Union. We want the European Union to thrive. We want it to be a force for good in the world for all the reasons I was saying earlier about the amount of malign activity that together we need to contest. President Macron has talked in terms of the European developing in a way that has a deeper inner core and a looser outer ring, and it is conceivable that over time it would indeed develop in that way, but that's premature to talk of that now. We, as I say, we are not encouraging anybody else to leave the European Union. There are some countries and some governments in the EU who think that Britain must pay quite a harsh price for leaving, that we must be punished. We don't see it like that, obviously, but we don't see it like that because, as I say, this is unprecedented. There is an opportunity here to set the rules of European affairs in a way that benefits both sides. And that is what we're going to encourage the Commission and others to look at. For obvious reasons. But one reason, of course, is trade. And as I was saying earlier, free trade is going to be a very helpful lubricant for relations between Britain and the European Union. On the Prime Minister's Chequers proposals, for the same reason, we don't see it as cherry-picking. We see it as a different concept. The Prime Minister is trying to find a credible, feasible, workable way of meeting the requirements of a productive and liberal trading relationship, regulatory alignment, and preserving the position of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, and not giving any excuse to those who would like to make the Northern Ireland question harder and more divisive and possibly even see a return to violence. So we will keep talking to our European Union counterparts about how best that can be brought into play. And there will be some more discussions with the EU in October and November. So you'll forgive me if I don't go into too much detail, because while we want a cooperative relationship with the European Union, it would be stretching that too far to actually tell them our negotiating strategy.
Yes, back here.
Thank you, Ambassador. So how will the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Nikki Haley's announcement to resign, affect the strength of UK-U.S. relations and the United Nations and the credibility of the partnership of the two countries in the international community?
Well, that's a very topical question, thank you. But allow me to begin by saying, first of all, that I admire Ambassador Haley enormously, both as an individual person. I value her friendship. She has been very kind to me since I arrived. She's a very gracious person, but I also admire her professionally. She has bags of ambition. She's driven things forward in the UN, such as the sanctions on North Korea, showing great negotiating skill. She's saved money in the UN budget. She's pushed UN reform forwards. She's made a start on doing something about the terrible situation in the conflict on South Sudan. So she has really been a force for good, and I think she is an outstanding representative for America and the American people. We always work very closely with the American government, the United States government in the UN. Most of the time we actually physically sit next to them, because a lot of the seating in the UN is done alphabetically, and we share many of the same goals and objectives. We don't share all the same goals and objectives. We did not agree with the move of the US Embassy to Jerusalem. We did not agree with the United States pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So it will not be seamless. But what we do share is the same overall goal about maintaining international peace and security. And we in the French, as you will have seen, acted with the Americans in respect of the use of chemical weapons in Syria. And all three of us are on record as saying we will respond appropriately if chemical weapons are used again by the Syrian authorities. So there's a very close identity of aims there that I think transcends whoever sits in the chair for either US or UK as ambassador. But Ambassador Haley isn't leaving yet. We will be able to work with her till the end of the year, and we look forward to that. I look forward to that.
Yes, over here.
We just had a new report from the IPC, which is extremely alarming. And given the current situation, there are sectors of American society that are participating in meetings with the UN and trying to meet goals. What do you think are the prospects in the near future for work within the UN on our climate goals? I know there's another conference coming up. And how would you encourage American people, notwithstanding our president, to support these goals?
I think it was well said at the point at which the US withdrew from Paris that actually through voluntary action by individual US states and other entities, the United States actually meets the majority of its Paris commitments. And I think that's very important, because it shows there's a very solid body of opinion in this country that supports action against climate change for all its controversial in certain circumstances, but also that the work to make good on those commitments in Paris continues irrespective of that top level of international affairs. So I think that's definitely something to build on. Of course, we will continue to encourage international cooperation and encourage the United States to engage with us on more practical measures. But the fact that the voluntary side of things is robust is a very good start. I think generally your question perhaps masks a view in America that struggles with the value of the United Nations in today's world. I think that's a pity when you look at the extent to which America built the United Nations. I don't know if anyone has read the Schlesinger book about the founding of the UN, but what comes through that really clearly was the effort that certain people in Congress, it was a bipartisan effort, people in the administration, PACs all over America put into building the institution that's the United Nations. And I think it would be good if the UN itself can do more to explain to people around the United States why it adds value to US prosperity and security. I think climate change is a key part of that.
Yeah. And then.
Thank you, Ambassador. I was just wondering, like, as the face of the UK in the UN, how you reconcile the UK's professed mission to uphold human rights and Theresa May's own preoccupation with protecting minorities with certain domestic scandals like Windrush, like on the international stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question, which is also very topical. The British government set out its position on Windrush, and it's made clear that it shouldn't have happened, and it will pay compensation, and people have lost their jobs in government because of what happened on Windrush. So from that point of view, I don't see a contradiction. On the contrary, although it's sad and deeply regrettable that such actions occurred, the fact that there is redress and the fact that there are apologies are an important part of dealing with human rights and trying to uphold the principle of equality before the law. The British government has made some quite liberal moves on human rights recently. I don't know if you followed April's Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, but there the British government set out what it had done on same-sex marriage, but it also noted that of the 53 countries in the Commonwealth, some 37 still have colonial-era legislation that restrict, if not outright ban, LGBT activity, and the British government has said we will make our legislative templates available and our assistance available to any of those Commonwealth governments who wish to modernise their legislation. So it is an important issue for us. We do keep moving forwards. I myself don't see a contradiction at the UN. I'm proud to speak out in terms of what the British government does. But I think all governments need to recognise that there will always be occasions when we're shown not to be perfect, when we're shown to have made mistakes. I think what matters, as in so much of life, is how you own up to those mistakes and what you do about putting them right. And I think actually on Windrush, deeply regrettable as it was, the government has taken action to do those things.
I think over here, yeah, right back there.
Thank you, Ambassador. One of the main people behind Brexit was Boris Johnson, your former boss. It was widely reported in the British media that he was a hugely incompetent Foreign Secretary. I wonder if you could confirm or deny those reports.
I'm not weaseling out of the question, but I didn't actually hear it. You want me to say if I deny the reports that Boris Johnson was incompetent?
He was for a while. I'm just wondering, at the time when he was the Foreign Secretary, was he a hugely incompetent Foreign Secretary, or was he actually not so bad?
Well, I'll make it even easier for you. I was his main policy advisor because I was the Director General for Political Affairs. So I can assure you he was not an incompetent Foreign Secretary. He was... I'm sorry?
Why was it reported as that?
Well, why does the media report anything as anything? You know, the media likes to attach Homeric epithets to people. There is no doubt that Boris Johnson is an interesting and at times divisive character and has always been so. And the media liked to portray him in a certain way. and they didn't always spend too much time looking at the evidence. So I would say in the time I and my colleagues were working with Boris Johnson, we started a Yemen political process. We started a Libya political process. We supported the UN in trying to get a Syrian one underway. We upheld the Iranian nuclear deal. He went to Iran. He went to Russia. The actions of Russia were what brought the crafting of a more productive relationship to an end when the Russians poisoned the Skripals in Salisbury. But I think it was Boris Johnson's contention that we needed to put our shoulder to the wheel on the really big foreign policy issues of the day. He was not afraid to own up to mistakes on Syria, on Libya and elsewhere. And he felt that, however difficult, we needed to try and make these things improve. He was also a huge advocate of girls' education, which he saw as one of the chief drivers of stability in countries, particularly economic stability, but not just that. So along with the International Development Secretary, he started a campaign to support 12 years of quality education for girls around the world. But as you also know, he has a different position now. He's not in government, so I won't comment on his position at the moment.
Could I intervene while the microphone is moving over there? Could I intervene and ask a question about the geopolitical context that we're witnessing in recent years? Ukraine, Minsk still incomplete, unfinished business, Russians still in control, Syria, enormous war crimes being committed, Yemen, another problem area, the flow of refugees out of the Middle East to Europe, which of course has created enormous domestic political issues for the Europeans. In all of this, it seems to be the case, the world we have now is a world which is really dependent on what the great powers are doing to each other and not collectively. And it raises a question about the inability of the UN to step into crises that are of a magnitude that we haven't witnessed before. And so, short of removing the P5 veto, which doesn't seem likely anytime in the future, even if the UN has reworked some of the internal operations, how do those interested in the supranational governance reassert their authority and legitimacy in the face of, well, it's easy to name one individual, Vladimir Putin, but others, the Chinese and some would say the Americans or the Iranians or the other powers. And you've seen this in your own career firsthand in the case you were ambassador in Afghanistan, which is a long-standing and continuing battle. So what are the prospects do you see, without a reorganization of the UN institutions, for a reassertion of supranational governance and authority for the rules of the traditional liberal international world?
I think the first thing I'd say, Professor Cameron, is I don't see the two things as contradictory. I think you can have both great power collaboration and supranational frameworks for rules and values. In fact, I think some of these really difficult issues like Syria, but before them, Rwanda, Srebrenica, going back even further, Korea, actually can't be done or can't be done alone by a body like the UN, precisely because they involve so many national interests and so many critical national interests of really powerful nations. But what you can have and have had is cooperation between those nations, notably the US and Soviet Union and Russia, but not only, to use the UN for certain tasks, but to agree a way forward between themselves. And this has happened intermittently on Syria, but never at a critical mass enough to make a lasting difference on the ground. It could still happen again. The key, as you say, is President Putin. And I think one of the keys to President Putin is actually all these other countries like Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, even China, which has a different slant on these sorts of issues, saying to him that it is actually important, not necessarily just for the sake of the UN, but for regional stability and security and things like the security of shipping in the Gulf, that Russia starts to cooperate. And you see a little bit of this on the agreement she reached with Turkey on Idlib. You see other countries, in fact, coming to the fore that aren't great powers because their interests are directly engaged, and who knows exactly how that will play out. I think there's a big question on Idlib as to whether this is a reprieve or a stay of execution. Obviously, we hope it's the former, but a lot of people fear it may be the latter. But certainly for the moment, that is holding, and the United States is backing it. So I don't think it's inevitable that this sort of thing can't happen. The Balkans, there are a series of agreements in the Balkans, beginning with Dayton, which Richard Holbrooke orchestrated, where the Russians did come in and cooperate. After 9/11, as I mentioned earlier, the Iranians and even the Syrians did come and cooperate on CT. A lot depends on the individual leaders, and a lot depends on how the national interests of each country are framed. So we need to obviously do better at bringing the commonalities to the fore. But where we can't do that, then the one thing the West can do is stand back until the Russians are ready to accept Western help, which will mean accepting a proper political process on Syria. And we've been very clear that we won't put reconstruction money into Syria till we see that process. We will, however, put humanitarian in. And I think that also underscores another bit of the international system which we haven't talked about, which is the extent to which the West pays for it. And now, emerging powers, to Saudi's credit, the Emirates' credit, Kuwait's credit, they are putting huge amounts of donor funding into Syria. The countries which aren't are Russia and China, and that, sad to say, is a form of leverage.
Yes, over here, right here in the T-shirt. Yeah, right there.
Ambassador, thank you very much for your thoughts. I would like to come back to Brexit for 1 second. So usually when you want to leave an institution, you need some reason, right? I mean, of course, in your case, it's the people's will. You had a referendum, but you said, for example, you would like the EU to succeed. So I would guess you agree with the values of the EU and things like that. So what is the main problem, or what is the main advantage of Brexit? So from the UK perspective, so what problem you can solve by leaving the EU, and what is kind of the opportunity for making such a step?
We didn't, the British people, the British government, British opposition and parliament didn't sit down and do a cost-benefit analysis of whether to stay in or leave the European Union. The question came up as a result of a commitment made by the previous Prime Minister. and then you had a campaign, and as you say, you had a referendum and a democratic decision, and that was all based on rules set by Parliament. So we are where we are, and the Prime Minister has been really clear that we will make a success of Brexit. For very many people in the UK, it goes back to that Churchill quote I mentioned earlier. You have the United States of America, you have a United States of Europe, and you have a United Kingdom in the middle. For all sorts of historical reasons, Britain has a very different tradition from very many, in fact most, of the European Union members. And we can talk about that, but it's self-evident in many ways. And Britain has never really seen the European institutions as necessary to protect her against the ravages of her own government, as has happened in recent centuries in some of Europe's other members. So we start from a fundamentally different place. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I commend a book by Dominic Sambrook about the 1970s in Britain, which describes the sorts of questions put to the general public as Britain was going into the European Union 40 years ago. And you can map some of those onto the responses you heard around Brexit, which I think is fundamentally something about national character and national desiderata. That said, we have an awful lot in common with the European Union member states, and we want this to succeed, and we want it to be a success for them as well. Nothing is inevitable. This is a very unusual, unprecedented move. It deserves an unprecedented level of partnership.
Yes, right over here, a fellow with the glasses. Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. So you've said that the British government is on record saying that it wants the European Union to succeed. Brexit hasn't happened yet, and within the context of the ongoing negotiations, I think this stance is very pragmatic. But do you think that if Brexit proves to be difficult domestically for the UK, which by all forecasts it suggested it will, in the short term at least, the same goodwill that exists at the moment will fade? As a British citizen, I can't help but think that the Brexit process is simply initiating greater anti-EU sentiment within domestic politics. Even if we get checkers is unacceptable to many politicians, including Boris Johnson, because it isn't the dream Brexit that they had envisioned. This is simply providing fuel for a populist movement that we need to be more independent from Europe, blaming Europe for being harsh on the UK during Brexit negotiations, and thus inflaming further anti-EU sentiment rather than further cooperation.
I don't think I accept the premise of that. I'm not going to comment on individual politicians in the United Kingdom because I'm a civil servant, so it's my job to be politically objective and neutral and impartial. The British civil service is not like the American civil service. We do not have political appointments. So you will forgive me if I have to be completely neutral and impartial on this question. But it is my job to support the government, and the government has set out very clearly that we will make a success of Brexit, however we come to define that. And I think there is still enormous amounts of goodwill in Britain for the European Union member states and our relations with them. Our history of being engaged in Europe goes back centuries and will endure. And I think the converse is also true. There is a tremendous amount of goodwill in the European Union for Britain and what Britain represents, particularly on the world stage. I can see someone shaking their heads, but that's how it looks to me.
I don't think that there is a lot of goodwill towards Europe. I don't see it, to be honest with you. As a European, I don't see a lot of goodwill in the UK towards Europe.
Well, you see...
I think it's a clean break in the meantime is the best. A really clean break is going to be the best. And the UK will have whatever they had set out solution is always going to be a bone of contention. You know, people are going to keep on quarreling. A clean divorce is really the best, you know, as I see. I was, in the beginning, extremely disappointed at the result, but in the meantime, I say the so-called no deal is the best.
Well, that's not the policy of the British government, which I've set out. I think there is a lot of recognition that there's a lot of shared history and common values with Europe, and there's a lot of recognition that a liberal trading relationship with Europe with the EU is in both sides' interests. And there is a lot of recognition that there are some very serious threats coming have already come to European security from the actions of Russia, and that we must stand together on that. So actually, what I see are things that are transcending some of the geography just in the issues we have to deal with now. And I think that is going to continue. And I think we will be able to find a productive way of working with the European Union, even as we are outside it.
Could I intervene and ask a question from the point of view of Europe, notwithstanding my name? From the point of view of Europe, is Brexit a good thing for the Europeans in terms of security policy, foreign policy? One of the great achievements of the Treaty on European Union, the Maastricht Treaty, was the creation of a common foreign and security policy, and the CSDP that we've had that has come from that. And Europe is obviously stronger as a United States of Europe in a Churchillian sense, stronger with the UK in than out in terms of security. Yes, we have NATO, but I would think from the point of view of the EU, it will feel that it is much less capable of asserting itself globally, regionally, geopolitically, in terms of security, without the UK in the meetings, making the policies. So from a European, and this is something that really doesn't seem to get talked about much in the media. There's so much focus about checkers and trade and so forth, but it does seem to me the entire area of security, cooperation, intelligence sharing, all of this is a very important setback for the Europeans. If I were a European leader, I'd be probably as much concerned about that as anything else. So is that right, or can the Europeans say, oh, well, we'll always have the UK with us because we're all in NATO?
Well, as you know, not all European Union countries are in NATO, so there's a nice irony about the ones that
some of them are
not still benefiting from the nuclear umbrella that NATO provides. But that's a separate set of questions. I think you're right. There hasn't been a huge amount of focus publicly on the security side, and that is definitely something where Britain has enhanced Europe's approach and the EU's capabilities. So that's a very important asset. It's a very important relationship, and it's going to be even more important as a matter of practicality if one looks at the sorts of things that the Russians and the GRU have been doing recently. And the latest, of course, was publication of what the Dutch had found in relation to GRU officers trying to attack the International Chemical Weapons Institution in The Hague. And I think these things are very much at the back of leaders' minds, and they are one of the things that keep the negotiations moving forward. But the Prime Minister has been clear, we're not going to bargain with Europe's security, but yes, it is an important part of what will be the future relationship between us.
Yes, right here.
Hi, thank you, Ambassador. The country which other than the UK, will probably be affected most by Brexit is Ireland. And in the neat Churchillian notion of the US, the United States of Europe and Britain, it's not clear where Ireland lies there. There's a lot of anxiety in Ireland at the moment, partly just as a result of the UK's sovereign decision to leave, but partly also because of the, indifference and hostility to the Good Friday Agreement among at least British politicians and arguably some within the British government. So I suppose my question is whether the Good Friday Agreement, in the view of the British government, is sacrosanct, or in the same way that you respect the right of President Trump to bring the US out of the Paris Accord, whether we should respect the right of Britain to pull out of the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, I have to say I'm a bit horrified by that question. The government and Theresa May have made it very clear that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, but that it is absolutely vital to preserve the peace process and to preserve the gains that have been achieved on both sides as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. And we recognise that the current situation has a lot of difficulties in it for Ireland. We want to work through those with our Irish counterparts and the Irish Prime Minister and his government. It does go back to the nature of the Chequers trade deal. A lot of the other issues are capable of being resolved without bringing the border question into play. But the Prime Minister has been very clear that she has the welfare of Northern Ireland as a whole right at the centre of what she's trying to achieve. And we recognise that Britain and Ireland are very closely linked in the European Union. For people who don't know, we have some special arrangements that apply just to Ireland and the United Kingdom. And we need to work very closely together to find a way of not losing all those gains. But there's no doubt in the government's mind that the political process, the peace process in Northern Ireland is extremely precious, and that we want to keep it and we want to preserve those gains for the citizens on both sides of that border.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we have to bring this to a close. We could go on for quite a long time, but there are classes that are going to be meeting in a very short amount of time, a few minutes. So I want to thank the ambassador for being here, and please join me in thanking her for her talk.